Damn, Godzilla. You're mistaken if you think your powers are a match for Mechagodzilla. Hey guys, what's going on? This is Brad from the Ad Army, and today I have another off-the-cuff video. I've decided I'm going to do some of these off-the-cuffs focusing on the Godzilla series, because I do have some other videos I'll make for them, but for me, it gives me just time to talk about it and have a good time. So pretty much that's what we're going with today, with today's episode, and as you can see by the thumbnail, it's actually going to be focusing on Mechagodzilla, specifically Showa Mechagodzilla. And there's a big reason I want to focus on Showa Mechagodzilla, but before I get into it, as always, you know what to do, guys. Leave a like, comment, and subscribe. You know that hitting that little button is a little thing for you, but hitting that button is a big step for me, and I'd appreciate it very much if you guys could. I'm trying to get to 100 by the end of the year for subs, and we're almost there, like 16 short. So if you hear this and you enjoy what I do, please go ahead and subscribe. Also turn your notification bell. It just helps out with seeing when new videos are coming. I handle different types of, media that I kind of enjoy. So far, I've gone Godzilla, Yu-Gi-Oh, Digimon. Those are like the main things I kind of like, but I've also had other things too down the line. So it is a bit more on the anime focused stuff, I guess, for some people, but also I like to talk about, sometimes life things, but more so I keep those videos on to lesser extents for something like the Off the Cuff series, because it gives me time just to talk about something that may be a little bit more serious and just kind of like pace it out for you guys, so you don't have to rush into it trying to just hear me force into something like 10-15 minutes, and really just listen to hear it for about the half-hour time that I usually like to go for. I think it's a bit more digestible for something that's similar to like a podcast where you can just sit down and relax and hear it, but it's not going to take up your whole day. Like maybe if you're cooking or something, or you're in the car, you could put this on and be like, okay, cool, listen to it for your like 20-minute, 30-minute commutes. So, I appreciate it. And we're going to get into today's topic that we're going to talk about, and it's actually Showa Mechagodzilla and why it's terrifying. Now, obviously, it's a pun on the second film that Mechagodzilla returned in Terror Mechagodzilla, but I kind of want to talk about the impact that these two films had on the series and the generation of Godzilla movies. So let me start off probably with the Showa era before I get into Mechagodzilla, because the Showa era is very important in getting to this point. Now, if you were to watch the Showa era films, they're all pretty good. I wouldn't say any of them are bad. I would say some of them are goofy. Like a lot of the plot starts to become a little bit more ridiculous or a little bit more for kids, obviously, but I would never say that they're bad, because they all carry their own type of weight. They're meant to be more of a good feel story. Not technically junk, because I remember some people telling me Showa movies, some of them were junk, and I'm like, they're not junk. They teach you lessons, but you have to really look underneath and kind of get over the fact that it's a monster movie. But sometimes it's asking a lot from viewers, and it's not saying that viewers have to see that. It's just more of sometimes you got to explain it better or try to get it out there with your messaging. But yeah, the Showa era. Oops, sorry, I had a phone call. Getting back into it where I was. If you look at the Showa era, a lot of the films up until we get to Godzilla versus Mechagodzilla were, yes, on the goofier side, but I think what Godzilla and Mechagodzilla do for the entire series is it puts the framework together for what the series was going to be about going forward. And I know some people will say, well, they obviously set that up after the first Godzilla film where they wanted Godzilla to fight other monsters. And that's true. That is true. But what Godzilla vs. Mechagodzilla did was it set up the theming that would be needed to continue the series when it would return, but also show the culmination of how Godzilla became. So first, starting off with Godzilla vs. Mechagodzilla, the premise of the movie itself is pretty obvious, because it's supposed to be, this new technological weapon aliens are invading. I really like the fact that its understory is more of technology versus, machine versus life, right? Or man versus machine, or beast versus machine in this case with Godzilla and King Caesar. But the reason it's important is that Mechagodzilla in its premise is goofy, right? A lot of people would say it was goofy because when you see Mechagodzilla in the first part of the film, it actually shows up with like a Godzilla skin, like it's wearing a Godzilla costume, and he's causing havoc so that things would be blamed on Godzilla. Obviously, he ends up fighting Anguirus, and then Anguirus bites a piece of Godzilla, or knocks a piece of the costume off and you see the metal underneath. So then you know obviously that there's something underneath the skin of this thing, so it's not Godzilla. So the premise there is already interesting. But you see that since Anguirus was very important in the movie prior, or I might be getting them out of order, but when Godzilla ended up fighting against Gigan and King Ghidorah, Anguirus helped it defeat both of them to send them back into space. So you know that at least Anguirus isn't weak in any stretch of the imagination. But you see Mechagodzilla effectively beat Anguirus really quickly, I would say, and then even cause almost a fatal, well, not fatal, but serious and severe injuries. So severe that Anguirus doesn't even show up for the rest of the film. It doesn't even show up into the subsequent film either. So obviously we know Mechagodzilla, or this thing that's there, is very, very strong. So it sets a tone of severity and a tone of seriousness, because if you think about it, even the music is kind of, some people are like, oh, it's not really to be taken seriously, because it's like those if you guys know what I'm talking about, the Godzilla themes in the Showa era, some of them are really capture the scene, like the scene of the situation, like Godzilla's theme obviously, but some of the other music is just background music that it kind of feels like it wasn't meant for it, but they just decided to score it in. And this was one of those fights that has one of those scores where it's kind of like, I would say like upbeat, but it doesn't fit the fight situation, but it works. And you notice that Mechagodzilla takes the stage here, even though I think the phrasing would be fake Godzilla because it's not Mechagodzilla yet, but fake Godzilla takes the stage because it just immediately seems like it's dangerous, because it's beating up Anguirus, it hurts Anguirus, it even does like King Kong's fatality, if you guys have ever watched the 2004 movie, where like it pulls the bottom jaw and the upper jaw away, so you know, like snap. Fake Godzilla does that to Anguirus, and when you watch it, you're like, wow, that's pretty vicious, right? It's like, wow, it's pretty dangerous. And then when fake Godzilla runs into the real Godzilla later on in the film, and they start fighting, it seems like Godzilla may have the upper hand, but then once it's revealed that this is like a robot Godzilla or robot-based mech, it immediately takes the stage again by revealing its true self and absolutely beating Godzilla in their first fight. I think that it's very interesting because Showa Mechagodzilla is like the goofiest design, obviously, but it has so many elements that just allow it to be unique and it almost kind of revolutionizing what we would get for the series, because obviously mechs and stuff had already existed in like anime and stuff. Also Zone Fighters, Ultraman, stuff like that, they had already existed. So this isn't something where I'm saying they made a revolution to like the world, but it was like revolutionary for the Godzilla series because there hadn't been a robot enemy really. There had been cyborgs because Gigan's supposed to be a cyborg, but it's not really touched on enough. But Mechagodzilla is the first true robotic character, so like a first robotic monster. Well, never mind. There is Mecha Kong. I just remembered there is Mecha Kong, but let's be honest, King Kong and inside the Showa era kind of falls off after a while. So, or not even after a while, it falls off after like 2 or 3 movies. So there's no real point to talk about King Kong from Toho, but hey, maybe for the future or something, I don't know. The point I want to get across to is Mechagodzilla ends up being this character, this robot character that really does settle this, or set the tone for what's to come, in my opinion, or what can be. Because Mechagodzilla, honestly, design-wise, I love it. It has everything it needs to effectively be what it was meant to be, a killing, conquering machine. It's got tow missiles, it's got hand missile. Oh, I remember, I can't remember who the guy's YouTube is, but if I remember later on, the guy who does Godzilla, who did the Godzilla-thon videos, I watched all of those. So shout outs to him if he ever sees it, or if you guys know, drop the guy's channel in the comments. But I love those, and I always thought it was hilarious because when they talk about, he obviously talked about Mechagodzilla's armaments, its weapons. It's hilarious because, yeah, Mechagodzilla, at least this one's way overtuned. And it would be something going forward. Mechagodzilla's iterations would be way overtuned as like killing machines. Like I said, they got tow missiles. He's got tow missiles. He's got hand missiles. He's got a chest laser. He's got laser eyes. He has a whirling head. He can fly. He can do all these things that, obviously the normal monsters of the series can't really match. The only one who could kind of match all those characteristics was something like King Ghidorah, but even King Ghidorah couldn't necessarily was it match the firepower output. It did have its lasers, but most of the time it was. I always thought King Ghidorah was weird because every time he shows up, he's usually ends up firing beams and then gets into grapple situations with other monsters, and it's like not his strong suit. He can fly, but I get it. It's kind of limitations of the time. But yeah, it's just I always thought that was hilarious because King Ghidorah could just literally stay up in the sky and blast other like monsters. But you know, things are things. Mechagodzilla, though, on the other hand, has all the capabilities to be a weapon of war, and it does it really well. Like the undertone of the movie with obviously machine versus beast, or machine versus culture, or even culture versus machine is an element too, because you see that the aliens want to just terraform the earth to their own will and their own control, so they don't really care what the humans want. They're going to subjugate them anyways. And you get to the point where obviously the girl and her father wake up King Caesar, and honestly, here's the thing: I'm not a big fan of King Caesar. I remember watching the film as a kid when it was like on TV. That's when Godzilla films were like on marathons on different channels, so that kind of gives you a reference of how old I am. Point aside, I thought it was always hilarious that when she does the singing for King Caesar, the first thing I thought was, man, where has he been this whole time? Like, why is he just waking up now, considering Godzilla was ravaging the country for, at this point, because it would be like 73, 74 when Godzilla vs. Mechagodzilla came out, for about like, in theory, 20 years. So I'm like, if because all of the Showa films technically spawn off of Godzilla the original. So I'm like, if this Godzilla has been terrorizing, Japan for this long, how come they're now just waking up King Caesar? I mean, like, wouldn't it have been useful to help during these other fights? But hey, whatever, I get it. It's understandable. Also, the Guardian monster thing would be very important for other films down the line. And yeah, we haven't had really one since in the same way that he was, but we digress. Point aside, Godzilla versus Mechagodzilla, they wake up King Caesar. He goes to fight Mechagodzilla, and it seems like, oh, he might be able to do it. Then all of a sudden, Mechagodzilla is like, well, I've caught him, and then he starts literally just beating King Caesar down. So if you watch the Godzilla film, the Godzilla-thon video, he'll say like beating the hell out of him or something, which is like really funny because it's exactly what happens. It's like you just see a scene of him like punching, kicking, whacking, and then he like throws him. Yeah, it kind of shows that although they woke up King Caesar and he is fighting Mechagodzilla, he is still no match for Mechagodzilla, which shows how strong Mechagodzilla really is that even this new monster, which is supposed to be very, very powerful, that woke up to help fight, has no real advantage against Mechagodzilla. Like, one thing I like is Mechagodzilla uses like his eye lasers, and then King Caesar actually reflects them back, which shows that, oh, okay, maybe this is the way that King Caesar overwhelms Mechagodzilla. He keeps on like reflecting blasts at him to neutralize those. But you can't reflect back missiles, so boom, he gets whacked. The chest laser thing was cool. I think very important for the design for the future Mechagodzillas. But then we get to the point where Godzilla finally re-shows up, and effectively he's able to, with King Caesar's help, defeat Mechagodzilla. But to be honest, the thing that's interesting about the film is that if Godzilla hadn't been hit by all this like electricity, this lightning, he uses it as his ability to turn into like a magnet almost. And I'm not joking, it's what happens. So if you guys never seen it, or you guys know what I'm talking about, yeah, he uses his body like a magnet and draws Mechagodzilla in, which allows him to grab him, which obviously shows one of the only weaknesses with Mechagodzilla was they probably never expected it to be, one, reached by other monsters, which is pretty interesting because Mechagodzilla is very useful in this movie because it's a close-range combatant and a long-range combatant and a distance fighter too, and a ranged fighter with aerial combat skills. It's like all shown off in this film, and literally his only weakness was they didn't expect Godzilla or any creature to like get that close to where it could destroy the mechanics of Mechagodzilla. Like his head gets destroyed, or he gets turned around, wounded too much, and it snaps, he breaks down, and it basically shuts off whatever the computer is running him, and then Mechagodzilla is defeated from that film. However, when it ends and King Caesar goes back to sleeping and Godzilla leaves, the one thing that's very interesting, I think, about the movie is that everybody kind of is happy that it's over and it feels cheery. However, I think that the film was only missing like one more scene where they probably should have had it where everybody was kind of saying, "Oh, what a relief that Mechagodzilla's gone," because Mechagodzilla, honestly, of all the monsters shown off in the Showa era, was probably one of the first ones I think could have definitely taken over the planet, because it basically faced off against most of the monsters on the planet that were already really strong, and defeated Anguirus and defeated Godzilla alone. So without the extra power Godzilla got in the film, there was a good chance Godzilla could have been beaten by Mechagodzilla soundly, like almost completely defeated. And then even with King Caesar, if he had to fight Mechagodzilla alone, it's pretty obvious he would have lost. Which allows us to move into the next film. Now, my biggest thing about Mechagodzilla before I get into the second film is that I think that I didn't actually read exactly why they decided to make a sequel, because usually there hadn't been any sequel films. And what I mean is, they're also, all the films are connected to each other, obviously, like a continuity, so one happens after another. But I mean, to make a direct sequel to like the film. So this means like there has never been one where it's like Godzilla versus like Anguirus, and then Godzilla versus Anguirus 2, right? It's like, it's not like 2. It's like there's not a second one directly referencing they already fought before. This one immediately picks up essentially where the last one left off, but focuses on different characters. So you could obviously see like, okay, so the events of the film obviously take place after the events of the first one, but the time gap is smaller, and it's meant to be, oh, this is going to happen again. So you people would think, oh, this is going to be boring. I really think Terror or Mechagodzilla takes advantage of this gap concept that's very short, where obviously the black hole planet 3 aliens, obviously it's a weird name, but that's what they're called. They find the Mechagodzilla who is destroyed, rebuild him, and he's rechristened Mechagodzilla 2, even though he's basically the same in every way, which I don't think they needed to fix. I really think that the film does a great way of just opposing the first film to the second one, because what it allows us to see is that Mechagodzilla himself actually didn't. It almost feels like this. He only lost because of plot convenience, because Godzilla had to win the film because it's the Godzilla series. But Mechagodzilla probably could have taken Godzilla easily alone. And even in the end, it didn't seem like King Caesar was any help to defeating Mechagodzilla. It was more of Godzilla coming to help that sealed the deal. So Godzilla is literally the only thing as an obstacle, but the Planet Hull aliens realized that maybe it was actually the intervention of King Caesar that helped Godzilla win, which I personally don't feel like helped as much as like they give credit for. I think what it did was it just slowed down Mechagodzilla. I could have honestly seen Mechagodzilla like still losing to Godzilla in a different way, where I think if it got in close range with Godzilla, it would have just pulled him in and probably destroyed him that way, but separate issue. Point is, when you get into Terror or Mechagodzilla literally doesn't need any upgrades. He was effectively perfect in every way in the first film, so this one's just building off of those elements, really getting us to see, wow, this is like, I guess, the peak of what they wanted to show us with the robotic Godzilla, at least up to this point. And I really like it. There's lots of elements there that are fantastic, because we'd obviously get another monster, which is Titanosaurus. I really feel bad for Titanosaurus because he doesn't really show up at all after this. And I really think he's a very interesting monster. Maybe Toho brings him back like official capacity. My thing is with Titanosaurus, I really like the fact that he's not anything crazy. Like, he's literally just a giant dinosaur, and he uses his tail to make gale winds when he like swings it back and forth. But other than that, Titanosaurus is just a dinosaur. Whereas like other monsters are, yes, sometimes they're just something, but they have something wacky about them. Like I think about the mantis monster Kamacuras, or like the spider monster Comungus. They're basically just, animals, but with enhanced ability. So there's that. But in the case of like the Titanosaurus is actually a very interesting partner for Mechagodzilla, because he doesn't interfere. He takes care of the issue of, I think, what Mechagodzilla didn't have, because Mechagodzilla can't generate winds. He can create a shield by spinning his head, which is kind of weird, but it's cool, like a force field. But with Titanosaurus, it's honestly really smart because Mechagodzilla's, I think, only weakness it really had in the film was it can be damaged with that much fighting, but the key thing is it didn't have any backup. So if any other monster did show up, Mechagodzilla's forced to take them both on at once, which they did effectively do that with its rotating head that can fire from behind while the front fires, which is really cool. But I think the elements needed to kind of build the film to make it more high stakes was adding another monster to fight along the enemy, because now it means Godzilla's outnumbered and the military and the people were outnumbered. So it gave more depth. And we would kind of see this element change and go forth depending on the iterations of Mechagodzilla. So this Mechagodzilla, effectively, there's nothing really more to talk about except for maybe the upgrades they made, where in the film where it fights Godzilla and it ends up becoming a one-on-one. Godzilla takes the head off again, and it's like, oh, cool, I beat him again. Then they modified it so that Mechagodzilla can fight without its head. Has like this like laser, almost like a Brainiac type of skull underneath, and it just fires a laser at Godzilla, and the fight continues. Eventually, Mechagodzilla gets overcome by Godzilla, and, Godzilla wins and kind of goes off into the sunset. And, we wouldn't see anything else until they get the reboot series affected, or we start off with the Heisei era technically with the new movies. But my point is, with the Godzilla series and Mechagodzilla's influence, we would obviously get some breathing room before the next Godzilla films. But the key thing I like to talk about with Mechagodzilla is you really see the evolution of the Showa era all the way up until its end, where it started with just, kind of goofy monsters fighting one another to a serious threat really taking its place as a problem for the people and Godzilla, and finally kind of being overcome by a combination of allyship between the two, even though it's not necessarily spoken. So, obviously that's kind of where that leads on to other plot points as the movies would continue once they got into Heisei. So yeah, that's kind of where I'm going to leave it with the Mechagodzilla films, at least. But Mechagodzilla's influence on the series as a whole was very polarizing, I think, because it opened the window for mechas to continue, and we would see more. Some people would argue that Jet Jaguar technically counts as a mecha, but it's debatable. I think he's more like a cyborg or like a full robot. Whereas like Mechagodzilla's key factor was it was always a mecha, but it never felt like one in the first two films, except for when we get to Terror, we finally kind of see that he uses Dr. Mifune's daughter as essentially the main computer to help fight. So, opposite things. I guess I want to talk about some of the characters too, because I really think that the end of the Showa era was very important, because to us over here in the West, I think it's not as important. And the reason why is a lot of people in the West at the time, and even now, we probably would look at it as it happens because, they end up stop sending movies because maybe they stopped making Godzilla films and that's whatever. But it's very important that some of the elements that was created for Mechagodzilla was finished. So by the time Mechagodzilla or the Terror Mechagodzilla took place, it was 1974, I believe. So 1974 it had been 20 years of Godzilla. 20 years. 1975 I think is actually, so about 21 years of Godzilla, because Godzilla vs. Mechagodzilla was 1974, so I'm pretty sure that was that. But the point I want to get across with this version of Mechagodzilla in the film is that the elements were very important, because there was there's one specific actor that got their last big role in this film, and that's actually the man, am I forgetting his name? It's here somewhere. That's it. For Akiko Harada. He played Dr. Mifune, which is obviously the mad scientist, but funny enough, it's almost like a parallel, because this was the last film for the Showa era, and he started off the Showa era as Dr. Serizawa. So that was, I think it's arguably probably his biggest role, is playing Daisuke Serizawa from obviously the original Godzilla film. And for Mr. Harada himself, he played in a lot of the different Godzilla movies in different roles, but being able to finish his, I guess, last role in a Godzilla film, the reason why I'm saying is like, if you guys don't understand the span of time, so for him, it was 1954 when he starred in Godzilla. It's not in the time that it would have been, it was 1975, and he was still technically in a Godzilla film starring. So it's 21 years, guys, 21 years that this man was actually a part of the Godzilla Showa franchise. That's how long the Showa era lasted. I think it's just because it's the modern day, it feels like so long ago. But for them, that must have been a long gap of time to be in all these movies and finally be in like the last film that he had probably partaken for this era of Godzilla. And to just think that it's almost 70 years already, or 70 years plus, is absolutely insane. So, that's kind of where I want to go to, is that Mechagodzilla still even made an appearance in the Legendaries set in obviously Godzilla vs. Kong, which was, I think people weren't necessarily sure about what was happening. Like, they kept that a decent secret. So I remember seeing that during the pandemic, obviously, and I was in love. But I was in love because I was like, wow, yes, I like Mechagodzilla. Mechagodzilla is a very interesting character. A new iteration for it never gets me upset. I always think it's weird. And honestly, I think Legendary's Mechagodzilla kind of played a little bit of an homage, in my opinion, to the original Mechagodzilla in terms of design, because it looks goofy. Like, that's the thing I love. I like when Mechagodzilla kind of looks goofy. I like the other iterations too, like Mechagodzilla 2 from Godzilla vs. Mechagodzilla 2, which is kind of weird because it's technically the third film they fought, but whatever. Super Mechagodzilla, fantastic. And don't even get me started on Kiryu, because Kiryu is like amazing in terms of design. I think it hits everything I'd want. Obviously the Godzilla from Planet of the Monsters, that Mechagodzilla, I actually loved its design, but I was mad it never panned out, obviously because of how the series went. But, like, Mechagodzilla has made so many reiterations because I think it's the most unique, I think, of characters, because technically they're like, oh, it's just a ripoff of Godzilla that's machine, but it's the way that it usually interacts with Godzilla is the key, because not every Mechagodzilla can interact with Godzilla effectively. Like Godzilla versus Mechagodzilla 2 in the Heisei era, that Mechagodzilla doesn't really interact with Godzilla. It's mostly just a weapon. Whereas when we get to Kiryu has extensive history and interactions with the Godzilla of the present time. And even the Godzilla that we got in Legendaries, Godzilla vs. Kong, I really think that Mechagodzilla worked, even though it was only on the screen for a little while, because it shows the possibility of what can happen. And that's ultimately the key of what Mechagodzilla does. And that's why its terror was felt all across the series going forward, even though it was the last monster to show up technically in Titanosaurs, but the last new monsters to show up in the Showa era, and to make it all the way up until this point where people still want to see more. It just lets you know how impactful this character is. And yeah, the Showa era itself, I would say if you guys can get a hold of to watch them, go ahead and give them a shot. It's very important that you see them because the elements are there. And ultimately, when you finish off with Godzilla versus Mechagodzilla and then Godzilla, the Terror of Mechagodzilla, you will see the evolution from that first film in 1954 all the way 21 years later. So that's all I've got for you today, guys. And I think I'm going to keep it here and finish it. This was really fun to talk about Mechagodzilla and the Godzilla series a bit. I just like to talk about specific characters and kind of their ideas of extrapolating how important they are to their series, especially, Mechagodzilla, because he's one of the most polarizing villains and or sometimes heroes. And because of how long the series has happened, you're able to kind of design new elements for each character and, make them cooler. But I hope you guys like this episode of Off the Cuff, just to let you listen to it, and hopefully you heard something maybe you didn't know. Maybe you're just like, okay, cool, that's awesome. But that's what I've got for you today, guys. And as always, this is Brad from the Ad Army signing off. And for all of you out there, to sign on.